When I began this script, I really struggled where to begin. I think, ironically, that's one of the best ways to sum up the Yakuza series to someone not in the know. I think most people fall into two categories in this regard. You're either very knowledgeable about the series, its characters, and the 15 years of wacky criminal adventures that have brought us to this point, or you're somebody that discovered Yakuza via Bakamita YouTube videos and are now just dipping your toes into the chaotic, insane circumstances that define Yakuza as a series. For that reason, I'm going to preface this video with two disclaimers moving forward. One, I am an unapologetic Yakuza stan, full staring myself in the mirror, dyeing my hair black with a faux hawk as I order in a horrendously ugly gray suit with red button down on Amazon. I giggle with glee every time I see two seasoned gangsters hardened by a lifetime of sacrifice and loss, fighting their hearts out on top of Millennium Tower, despite the fact that the way they tear their suits off makes zero sense. Yakuza is a series that is very near and dear to my heart since I was gifted it by my father back in 2005. He thought he was providing me a Japanese Grand Theft Auto experience, given the advertising on the box and what was considered popular at the time. Oh, how little did he know the Yakuza beat-em-up karaoke simulator rabbit hole filled with diaper-wearing gangsters and cabaret club management that he was throwing his youngest son into. For the better part of 15 years, I've watched Kiryu Kazuma and his gang of merry Tojo men fight off the Omi, the Korean Alliance, the Chinese Mafia, and the Japanese government itself, all while learning the values of friendship, family, brotherhood, and loyalty when placed within the confines of a criminal setting. Obviously, I'm skipping over like a ton, and that's by design. This brings me to my second disclaimer that this will be a 3-part series, but not a full series retrospective of Yakuza as a whole. Yeah, if you gave me like 30 minutes, I could go over Yakuza 1 through 6 plus Dead Souls, and I could probably give you a decent summary of events, but that's not really the aim of this video today, and even experienced fans of the series will note the utterly insane amount of events that can occur within a single Yakuza game, let alone 6 mainline titles. Much like Yakuza 7, this video aims to look forward onto the Yakuza series as a whole and the possibilities for its future. That said, after beating this game to completion twice, Yakuza 7's story can be understood on its own even if you're not incredibly familiar with the previous titles, and I think that's a detail that's important for the sake of not gatekeeping new folk from appreciating our weird, tonally insane, but we swear this is a serious story about crime Yakuza soap opera without needing an entire appendix to decipher who everyone is and what the hell is going on. Right, so our story begins in we, the player character, Ichiban Kasuga, an orphan born inside a Japanese soap land, which are essentially legal brothels that skirt by regulations on technicality, turned Yakuza under the small yet formidable Arakawa family. Your patriarch is Masumi Arakawa, and despite being the head of a third-tier Yakuza family within the Tojo umbrella, Arakawa is known as Arakawa the Assassin. His name carries major weight in Kamurocho. In fact, this is how Ichiban meets his not father figure, because as you'd expect from somebody that was born in the basement of a literal brothel, Ichiban was a teen with no prospects, and one day he picked a fight with the wrong couple of Yakuza gangsters at war with the Arakawa family. And to make amends, Arakawa does the traditional slicing off of his pinky knuckle like the badass Yakuza daddy will come to know and love. While, yes, the glove he wears over his hand now is very, very cool, Arakawa gives up his finger for Ichiban's mistakes, and in all respects, he really should have just left you to get your brains bashed in by those men in ugly suits. However, Arakawa is a true old-school Yakuza who values things like saving face and respect. If he'd grovel over a single teenager's offense, how would that reflect on him? And for Ichiban, this becomes an essential model for his perspective on how a Yakuza ought to act. And for Arakawa-san, I like to think that in that moment, Arakawa saw in you the same desperate kid with the same slashed face that he once was, just trying to get by in a harsh, unforgiving world that honestly doesn't care about people like them. A side note that Arakawa's mother is the one that actually gave him that scar when she slashed him with a pair of scissors after essentially pimping him and his father out as a traveling kabuki theater troupe. This would go on until his father was assassinated by another Yakuza family over debts, but that's a little detail we'll get back to later. Flash forward a few years, and Ichiban's a grunt collecting money for the Arakawa family on New Year's Eve. The Yakuza grind never ends, and we'll very quickly see that Ichiban will continue the trend of main characters being the absolute worst criminals of all time. When Ichiban makes his collections, he makes sure that those who've been bamboozled out of their cash have it returned to them, like the shady dealer that dealt animal porn to high schoolers, which is, wow dude, just wow. He also lets a former classmate who owes his family money keep the cash because Ichiban knows his mother's terminally ill and the guy just wants to get his mom something nice for New Year's. While yes, it is very cheesy how Ichiban only takes the guy's wallet and none of the cash, haha, do you get it? It's a nice introduction to who Ichiban is as a person. Ichiban's naturally just a cheesy guy. He's deeply empathetic, and he not only cares deeply about his friends and families, but the issues of those around him. Even if he doesn't immediately know how to fix that person's particular problem, he's always willing to give a word of encouragement and even involve himself on that matter. He sometimes gives off-base advice, but he's always meaning well. He's someone that you can get behind that isn't just going to steamroll everyone like Kiryu would have. Shortly afterwards, Ichiban goes to pick up Arakawa's son so he can go to his girlfriend's birthday party. His name is Mitsu, but Ichiban's going to call him the young master. Mitsu's illness is a result of tragic circumstance. It goes back 20 years ago on New Year's Eve. When Arakawa-san was a young man, his patriarch made him date his daughter, but Arakawa already had a girl on the side, who would later become the young master's mother. He eventually gets her pregnant, and he comes clean to his boss, and naturally his boss decides that she's gotta go. After having the baby, Arakawa-san calls her and tells her to put the baby in a street locker to keep him safe. Arakawa does eventually get to the locker after fighting off waves of bad guys, but due to it being locked in the extreme cold, Arakawa punches the locker open to find young Mitsu nearly frozen to death. He would obviously survive, but his disability left him crippled and incredibly bitter. You can see how much he hates himself for feeling weak and inferior, and he routinely takes it out on Ichi. But Ichiban still views Mitsu as a brother, as the same way that he views Arakawa-san as his father. He takes a lot of Mitsu's shot in stride, and Arakawa tells Ichi later in the story how he hoped Mitsu would grow past his disabilities, but they do end up defining him and his motivations throughout the story. After wheeling Mitsu to the club, you pull into an alley and Mitsu pulls out a massive syringe. Apparently it's some American super medicine that temporarily cures his disability so he can frickin' walk, and he even gains a healthier skin tone. But magic EPO injection notwithstanding, you walk into the club and demand to see the boss's girl even though she's working that night as the main hostess. She's currently hosting an older gentleman, and after some discussions with Ichiban, Mitsu attempts to bribe his girl away from him, going off about how powerful people get what they want regardless of what is fair or what is right. But the man pulls an Uno reverse card on Mitsu, revealing himself to be Horino Uchi, the future Tokyo police commissioner. This scene is actually very pivotal for the story of Yakuza 7 and its characters, as it's one of the two most important scenes that happen in the club, demonstrating the concept of power and the levels that often come with it. Yes, Mitsu is the Yakuza-san's boss, and that affords him a certain level of status and legitimacy, but he's just that. He doesn't hold any official title, he's not even a Yakuza, and I'm fairly certain the guy doesn't even have a job. While Mitsu's hostess girlfriend is able to calm the situation, it's only because Horino Uchi consents does it end quietly. The second scene is much more powerful and definitely just a bit more sad. When Ichiban goes to the bathroom, he overhears in the stall Mitsu's girl and Horino Uchi just totally emasculating the poor guy. Horino Uchi and the hostess are in an actual, real relationship, and she's just digging Mitsu for cash. She's even going to pawn off the expensive watch Mitsu gave her for her birthday. To make matters worse, you learn that Mitsu overheard the entire thing, and he just shambles off, leaving you to pay the bill. Regardless of how much of a spoiled douchebag Mitsu does come off as, and actually is in reality, I could not imagine feeling so small and powerless in that situation. In that moment, his whole ego must have shattered as he learned that the aura that he had self-constructed around himself could be so easily played and bent and broken, and how Horino Uchi's actual power that he wields as a public figure commanded a respect that's beyond Mitsu as simply just a Yakuza boss's son. Ichi cleans things up at the club and heads back to the Arakawa family office to drop off the collections for the day. There you meet the second highest member of the family, Joe Sawashiro. Joe is a Yakuza hardass, much more traditional in terms of what a Yakuza should be good at, i.e. doing crime and making money, and he hazes Ichi for being a low earner. He does come off as a prick, but he really is just doing his job, and Ichi, like we said before, is going to be an awful Yakuza in the literal sense. While Ichiban's personal philosophy of standing up for the little guy is admirable, the family still has to pay rent for that office space, and local hero antics don't pay bills. However, before Joe can make Ichi atone by giving him a crash course in pinky finger sashimi cuts, Arakawa enters and pulls Ichi into his office. When you actually get to sit down and listen to Ichiban and Arakawa-san speak, it's actually really cool to see the much more human relationship between them, especially because Asian work culture is so infinitely stringent and tediously formal, as we just saw with Joe, especially when placed within the criminal atmosphere where respect and saving face will literally lead you to dismember your own finger digits. I think that often Asian culture, while Western audiences of Yakuza are much more knowledgeable about the major cultural differences that come from East and West, I don't think Western audiences sometimes understand how significant your elder speaking so lax to you means in our culture, especially with someone that holds in much esteem as Arakawa-san. This is a side note, but from the ages of 13 to 18, I worked as a martial arts instructor full-time. My mom worked the front desk while my boss and I taught class, and the reason, quite frankly, was because life was hard and we needed to find a way to make more money. We were all Korean, so my boss's and I relationship started off pretty strict. He wasn't actively being a dick to me, but I was an arrogant little shit, and he had different expectations for me as somebody that he saw was the same type of person as him, but too young to understand the little things that come with defining respect in adulthood. Often our elders inform us what we ought to do and to be like internally and externally. Straighten your back, don't rock against the wall, address people properly, and constant reminders to study even harder than you are right now. I think we all struggle with criticism, especially in the West where individualism is something that's revered and striven for. But for Asian culture, criticism is built into the societal DNA of the culture. There's always something to improve, to better, to change, and to learn from those who have been around longer than us. When Arakawa-san tells Ichi to never laugh with his teeth in public, he's saying it because he knows it'll help Ichiban represent himself better as a Yakuza. He's not just being a hard ass for the sake of it. But just like Arakawa-san, my boss knows when to take off a disciplinarian mask. We'd go out to eat, we'd drive to tournaments together, I'd babysit his daughter before class. Those lax moments where everyone is just shedding their skins a little bit means a great deal. It demonstrates a level of trust and respect that often our elders struggle to portray back to us, telling us stories from the past, especially deeply personal ones like Arakawa-san did about the events leading to Mitsu's birth and his disability. Those are deeply symbolic displays of the trust between an adopted son and an adopted father figure. The next day, Ichi gets called into the office after passing out on a bench like the bum with a heart of gold we know he is. It's a pigsty from the New Year's partying beforehand, but Arakawa-san clearly doesn't care. He's about to ask something very big of Ichi, and everyone watching knows it. In true Yakuza series fashion, you're going to be taking the fall for someone else's crime, and as per usual, it's going to be murder. Apparently last night, Joe got in a fight with a member of a higher-ranking Yakuza family within the Tojo, and ended up blowing the guy's head off. If it reaches Win, it was the Arakawa family, they're all essentially dead. So the solution, much to the dismay of Arakawa-san, is to exile Ichi from the family and have him take the murder charge so that the family can continue to survive. You can see the genuine pain asking Ichiban to do this when you look at Arakawa-san's behavior. In a lot of ways, Arakawa-san openly admits he wishes Mitsu was more like Ichi, more optimistic about the possibilities of life, rather than trying to drag everyone down. You can see how much it hurts Arakawa-san when Ichi enthusiastically agrees. In Ichi's mind, he owes his life to Arakawa, and this is a real chance to prove himself as a bona fide Yakuza, especially in an age where the traditional Yakuza is clearly dying. But for Arakawa-san, he's literally sending one of his favorite soldiers and one of his favorite sons off to prison until he's a nearly middle-aged man. 18 years later, and Ichiban is finally released from prison. 3 years earlier, Ichi had a letter sent to him by Arakawa-san telling how much he misses him and how he's still ready for Ichiban to get released so they can finally get their Peking duck. Obviously, Ichi has not been forgotten, but Ichiban unfortunately gets the cold shoulder on release day, apologizing to an audience of nobody about being in prison for so long and how he just wanted to make amends. Ichi may not be a Yakuza anymore, but still most of the time in this situation, somebody should have picked him up. The prison guard who was sympathetic to Ichi during his sentence lets him know that things have changed in the past 18 years. Yakuza laws are so broad now that organizations are a shell of their former selves in terms of front-facing power. This ain't the 80s anymore, where Kiryu can just walk around Kamurocho with the blood of the poor sap he just beat the piss out of so smeared on his face. They're not picking up chicks or ex-prisoners in Class C Mercedes anymore. And this actually reflects a real development in Japan's relationship with the Yakuza. In 2011, Japan passed much stricter ordinances concerning the Yakuza, but I don't think of the way Western audiences would naturally expect. You see, the Yakuza aren't outright banned in Japan the same way a mob organization in the United States are treated as criminal elements with no right to exist. In Japan, the Yakuza are regulated, not outlawed. Nowadays, it's illegal to pay off a Yakuza or to do business with them. Companies have anti-Yakuza clauses, excluding active Yakuza from doing things like opening a bank account, renting a car, or even buying a cell phone. While they're not putting their families on business cards anymore, Yakuza in Japan can't exactly lie about it when asked about in these situations, and it's really driven current Yakuza in 2020 as far underground as they've ever been since the end of the Second World War. It's important to note that the point of these measures, both in Yakuza 7 and in real life, were never meant to destroy the Yakuza in their entirety, even though membership is a shadow of its former self. More so, as Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in the National Police stated in 2011, the goal was to remove the Yakuza from the public eye, and in many ways the Yakuza still operates as they used to. They've diversified the revenue streams, and they're not outright beating people in public anymore, and they're still very much active in things like fraud, human trafficking, loan sharking, and often because of the underground nature of their businesses now, they're even more vicious than what they used to be. But what the Yakuza lost, and what's an important theme in Yakuza 7, was their front-facing power. People do not fear the Yakuza in the pop culture or societal context anymore since they've been scrubbed from the public eye, or at least not in the way that they were certainly used to. As stated by an ex-Yakuza boss amid the sweeping legislative changes and their impacts, the Yakuza are a franchise. You pay your association dues to borrow the power and the menace of the group. Fear makes people pay you, but if you can't use the name or the symbol, why even stay? It's like running a McDonald's without being able to use the golden arches. Better to cut expenses and leave. We're not vanishing, we're restructuring. End quote. Just like the interaction between Mitsu and Horinouchi in the Hostess Club, the mystique of Yakuza power has been muddied by an increasingly advanced age where it becomes much harder for criminal organizations to flourish, and how real change and power comes from those in society from whom society allows to wield it. Ichiban doesn't actually have a lot of time to process this disappointment before we're greeted by our first JRPG party member, complete with Chrono Trigger-esque jingle to go along with it. His name is Koichi Adachi, a lifelong cop turned driving instructor. He's got a bone to pick with specifically Horinouchi and how he disregarded the law for his personal gain as he was being promoted up the head of police. Adachi sounds a cool guy, like that favorite uncle of yours who's a bit of a mess but is always there to support you. He basically catches up Ichiban in the last 18 years and drops a couple of bombshells on both the audience and Ichiban. First off, the Tojo clan is basically gone from Kamurocho, which is just a weird thing to say after all this time. They've been supplanted by our old friends, the Kansai-speaking Omi Alliance from up north. It's revealed that several years ago, the new governor of Tokyo, Ryo Aoki, remember that name, alongside Horinouchi as the designated head of police, enacted the Kamurocho 3K plan. The plan was essentially to oust the Tojo from power, and it worked so well that even our favorite badasses of Saejima, Majima, and Daigo are currently in hiding and barely managed to escape the fallout at all. The twist is that the police were only able to have such a massive success because someone ratted out Tojo's secrets beforehand, and that person was Arakawa-san. As a result, he's now the acting captain of the Omi Alliance, while the actual patriarch, Watase, is in prison, much to the utter refusal of Ichiban to accept this reality. Ichiban's total denial of the situation does come off a bit annoying at first, with the literal evidence slapping him in the face, but after a while you begin to understand that's just who Ichiban is. He has complete and total trust in his loved ones, and even though they've betrayed him in some way, he still tries to find ways to justify their actions. While yes, this story note has an important twist later on, at this point in the game, Ichiban is acting almost fanatically loyal, which, in retrospect, I can't blame considering the guy spent 18 years in prison for Arakawa. Ichiban eventually makes it to the grave of the guy he supposedly killed that night, and he refuses to spill the beans to Adachi about what actually happened. Then, because this is Yakuza, we see a gaggle of gangsters walk past, and one of them is Arakawa-san in a matter of utterly insane circumstance. He's actually here to visit the grave of the previous Omi chairman, and the levels of denial Ichiban goes through to justify the situation becomes a little sad, especially after Arakawa-san just blows him off when Ichi calls out to him. But Ichi ain't the type of guy to just let that shit stand, so Adachi wisely considers they engage in some form of tactical retreat, and rather plan to raid High-End Tower, because Arakawa is meeting a bunch of Omi Alliance bigwigs there tonight. High-End Tower, if you remember, is the Chinese restaurant Ichi and Arakawa-san went to grab Peking duck 18 years ago, and it's also the place where Arakawa-san's father was murdered. Ichi takes the meeting place as a coded message from Arakawa-san, while Adachi notes the absurdity of the idea considering how it's like the only nice restaurant in the area and they had to pick one. While you're waiting, you actually meet a side character named Nick Ogata, a shrewd businessman that teaches Ichiban how to use a smartphone because, yeah, he's been in prison for the last 2 decades, and probably the last major piece of technology Ichiban's ever touched was like a fax machine or something. He'll become a significant investor for the game's company builder minigame that you'll have later along the line. The plan is Ichiban and Adachi-san will fight through the sewers to reach the bottom of High-End Tower and make their way up. I guess this is a good time to talk about the game's combat mechanics while I'm at it. Yakuza 7's combat is turn-based, and this comes as a result of Yakuza 7 being a full-blown JRPG, no longer a beat-em-up. As you progress through the game, you'll gather characters, you'll be given a wide assortment of cinematic heat moves, team heat moves, special moves, buffs for yourself, your party, and debuffs for the enemy. Apart from that, Ichiban has personality stats like passion and intelligence that he can boost throughout the game by completing side activities, which will boost the specific move's power that Ichiban will learn as you level up. You have a full-blown gear system and accompanying stats system that'll influence things like your health, magic, attack, agility. Gear was always something in previous Yakuza games, but often so inconsequential in most circumstances, I wouldn't be surprised if you legitimately forgot about it. But here, it's absolutely essential to keeping your character's weapons and clothing in tip-top shape to handle harder bosses and enemies further along down the game. And this really shouldn't even come to as a surprise, as Ichiban literally sees the world of Yakuza through the realm of Dragon Quest, an actual JRPG series in real life that Ichiban is a huge fanboy of, so he models himself after your traditional JRPG hero that you would have seen in the PlayStation 1 and 2 era. It's ridiculous, but it works because of Ichiban's complete dedication to his role, which plays off his naturally optimistic and helpful attitude. Heat moves in this game cost magic points naturally, and as you level your party up, you'll gain access to increasingly wild and expensive ones. You also have a summoning system called Pound Mates. Yes, I know, give me a second. It's a system where you can gather different NPC summons with a variety of helpful effects via beating side quests throughout the game, including helping out familiar faces like the return of Ono Michio, who is just the fucking best, and long series mainstay Gary Buster Holmes, who introduces you to the system to begin with. It actually felt really nice getting some more tangible rewards from side quests besides just a piddly amount of cash and the experience of hanging out with not Michael Jackson, and maybe the whole affair just had a fresh coat of paint on it because we weren't just going through the motions with Kiryu again. There was a lot of hoo-ha about Yakuza 7 having turn-based combat over the series' traditional beat-em-up format, and you can scour Reddit pages of fanboys saying they'll never touch this game because of the change to turn-based combat, and I simply do not understand the vehement hatred. It was like turn-based combat attacked your village like Genghis Khan and made off with your parents. In the West, there's a lot of criticism towards game developers whose series titles are often just minor reiterations of previous titles, but the moment our favorite Yakuza Jesus simulator shakes things up a bit, it's suddenly a huge betrayal to the heart of the series. So let's be very clear. Just because you don't prefer turn-based combat doesn't mean that a game simply having it is enough basis for criticism. Much like how your favorite dish might be completely foreign and gross to another person, we can use our brains to understand the merit of something we don't personally enjoy. You can criticize the ingredients, how the dish was prepared, and how that impacted the final product. That's all fine, and Yakuza 7's combat is not perfectly implemented by any stretch of the imagination, and often has the actual same problems that the beat-em-up combat did, especially with boss fights, but the act of existing itself isn't a crime. Don't get me wrong, I do love my Yakuza combat though. There is nothing better than being at the near end game when Kiryu and all your buddies have got all your crazy heat moves and you can show them off while fighting your heart out against waves of Yakuza grunts as you ascend Millennium Tower to eventually face this title's primary protagonist and possibly a secret antagonist depending on which game you're playing. But we really need to stop pretending like those boss fights don't just devolve into spamming square and 1 to 2 easily attainable heat moves because the boss is immune to like 97% of your entire move list. The introduction of side characters and multiple fighting styles did a lot to extend the freshness of Yakuza's combat for 15 years, and that's really something you have to give them credit for and commend them. But like Kiryu's involvement in the overall story, it felt like Yakuza had really capped out on what was left to do and innovate with the system. Hell, in my opinion, they even went backwards with Yakuza 6, getting rid of the fun multi-style gameplay for Kiryu from the previous titles. Plus, without any other side characters to balance out that sameness, Yakuza 6 is really the only game I've beaten and refused to pick up again from the Yakuza series. Not because I hate it, but just because I'm tired. Like a married couple that just is going through the motions at this point because the kids are all grown up and we don't know anything else. Alright, yeah, so back on track. Adachi and Kiryu eventually fight off the homeless and get through a couple waves of Yakuza baddies. When they get to the roof of the building, they figure out they're actually next to high-end towers, so they do this sick base jump across buildings that definitely would have killed someone like Adachi, but who cares. Ichi has to go out on his own after Adachi stays behind to distract a police chopper, and you finally make it to the dining room, but you're stopped by your old buddy Joe Sawashiro, who has aged remarkably well for someone you haven't seen in nearly 20 years. You have your obligatory pre-big story moment boss fight, and then Ichi barges into the eating room. Ichi is angry. He's confused. He just wants to know the truth. He loves the man sitting across the room from him and trusts him entirely despite all the circumstances leading up to this moment. However, for Ichiban, things are only about to get worse, as Arakawa, surrounded by Omi bosses and goons, and while looking Ichiban right in the eyes, pulls out his gun and tells him he has to die and shoots him in the chest. I like Ichiban a lot. I find him so refreshingly endearing in an age where I think we've all grown just a bit too cynical about the world. Ichiban's not a total goof. He's overly passionate and often fails to see the bigger picture in situations almost to an idiotic degree at times. He sees the world very plainly though, but he's not naive. He's passionate in his beliefs and how people should treat one another. In Ichiban's eyes, even being a Yakuza involves being more of a societal big brother than a malevolent criminal element. There's an innate earnestness to Ichi that I found profoundly endearing. He has such complete and utter trust in his friends and family. Even after being betrayed by the closest of allies, he still wants to find a way to act in their best interest despite all that. He's not Kiryu, and really that's for the best. Even by Yakuza 5, we were really stretching what was left to do with Kiryu, even from a side beat standpoint. We've beaten all the real estate moguls. We've performed all the taxi heat moves. I've climbed the stairs of Millennium Tower so many fucking times, Kiryu's calves must be made of titanium by now. Keeping Kiryu around too long also meant the story had to twist itself in increasingly absurd ways to keep up with the story from title to title, and that became an exercise in maintaining a person's sanity after a bit. Yakuza did begin introducing multiple characters to try and freshen things up, and that worked to varying degrees. Akiyama's cool. I love the fact that he's a bum moneylender with a heart of gold, and his tests for would-be clients were very fun to watch, but he isn't even acknowledged in Yakuza 7 to the best of my knowledge other than Sky Finance just existing in Kamurocho. Saijima's really cool. Saijima's style of fighting was always fun for me because I'm a sucker for pro wrestling, so Saijima's big boy grappling is just the tits McGee for me. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend that he's not even a remotely interesting character after you learn that he didn't actually kill those 20 guys he famously killed. That's actually made him less interesting to me because he hasn't done anything bad to justify the permanent scowl on his face. Fun fact, in Yakuza 5, when Saejima finds the hunting village after he escapes prison, I didn't actually know you could just leave the village after the first few hunts, so I did the entire hunting side quest with tracking animals, monitoring and collecting traps, and hunting a giant bear, only to discover I could have just fucking left like 4 hours earlier. Also, yes, I know, Majima's the best. Everything about Goro Majima is the absolute best. Getting a look into the Mad Dog of Shimano during Yakuza 7 and how he sacrificed everything for the Yakuza life and his conscious choice to act so short-fused and crazy all the time really does recontextualize a lot of his previous actions. The problem with all of those things, in all of those stories, even Majima's, is that they all orbit around the universe that is Kiryu's massive forehead. All stories, all ends, all roads lead to Kiryu beating the shit out of someone at the end of the story and saving the day. He is the ultimate equalizer that Denzel Washington would be jealous. He's such a fucking badass, he beat the shit out of 2 characters you just played as in Yakuza 4. I've never seen a series just job out protagonists for the sake of another like that before. With Kiryu, it really did come to the point where a story couldn't have stakes. People around Kiryu would get hurt and die. He sees the real Junji Han get shot in the head in Yakuza 6. His blood brother betrayed him after he took the fall for the murder of the Dojima Patriarch. But we all know the story will never allow Kiryu to fail because failure is the antithesis of Kiryu as a character. And Kiryu's story is ultimately the story that matters the most in terms of Yakuza's overarching writing. Yakuza was in such of a need of a fresh breath of air that Yakuza 5's idol simulator with Haruka was unironically one of the best parts of that game, full stop. And you know, a lot of people were apprehensive post Yakuza 6. Judgment was cool and introduced a different flavor of mechanics, but it wasn't really a Yakuza game. More like a story orbiting the general galaxy that was Yakuza's overarching plot. It really wasn't until Yakuza 7 where did we start to see a lot more concern about where the story was going to go moving forward in a post-Kiryu fake death world. And change is scary, and Yakuza's comedy really did rely on Kiryu's inhuman stoicism to bounce off the surrealist humor of the world around him. But after a decade and a half, we finally have a new chance for something fresh and a new story to branch off on. And it comes in the form of Ichiban and all his friends. And even though, right now, he's got a frickin' hole in his chest from the father figure he would have died to protect, that's way more vulnerable than Kiryu's ever been allowed to be portrayed as. And I think that's a really good start for something new.